4B is about World War One and what is going to be called a return to normalcy. So the previous unit had been about the growth and expansion of an American power during the age of American imperialism, and that's going to cause the United States to rub up against some of these other European powers. And we're going to see that Europe entered into this era of World War during the mid 1910s. And the cause for the World War One were often used through the acronym the main causes of World War One because it stands for militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And when all of these European countries start rubbing against each other, they all have big militaries. They've been expanding their militaries since the 1900s. There's these interlocking systems of alliances that are going to cause countries to be interacting with each other, both as allies and enemies more frequently. And they're all going to be competing over these territories for imperialism that they want. But probably the biggest and most important element of the main causes is nationalism. And nationalism is this idea that you want a state, a political organization only for your group of people. And what we're looking at here, this map, is a map of Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary was a big empire. It was made up of Austrians and Hungarians, but also all of the people that you can see in that list over there. And one of the groups that wanted to have their own political state were the Serbians. And the Serbians are in this circled area right here in a place called Bosnia, and their tentative capital was Sarajevo. And the Serbians were really mad because the Austro-Hungarians were not allowing them to have their political independence. And a Serbian nationalist, during a parade where the Austro-Hungarian crown prince Franz Ferdinand and his wife had come into Sarajevo, they were there on parade to show off their power. A group of Serbian nationalists, I believe referred to as the Black Hand, were trying to make a statement about pro-Sarajevo, pro-Serbian nationalism. They decided they were going to kill the crown prince. This guy here, who is assassinating Franz Ferdinand, I believe his name is Giovanni Principis, a member of that Serbian nationalist group, did murder Franz Ferdinand. And this kicks the alliance system in because the Serbians, while they were not officially their own political state, did have political connections to Russia. And the alliance system looks a lot like this map we have over here on the far left. The Serbians, who are over here in Bosnia, right, over here in Bosnia, they're going to be punished by Austria-Hungary. The Austro-Hungarians want to punish the Serbians. There's a list of like 20 demands that they made. The Serbians don't like any of that. If they don't meet the demands, then the Austro-Hungarians were going to attack the Serbians. That brought Russia in to defend the Serbians. But the Austro-Hungarians had an ally in Germany. So if Austria-Hungary is attacked by Russia, that would bring the Germans in to attack Russia. And Russia had alliances with France and Britain. So if Germany attacked Russia, France and Britain would come in and attack Germany and Austria-Hungary. And what you'd get is a world that's kind of divided in half, with France and Russia surrounding the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. And that's what happens. Russia mobilized for war, which triggered a German attack into France. The Germans figured they had plenty of time to worry about the Russians, who were slow. They had older equipment. They figured if they could swoop in, attack France, take the capital at Paris, then the French would be out. The Germans could then turn and focus on the Russians. But the French aren't dumb. They know that that's the German plan, to attack through Belgium. So the French ally all their forces right above here. The French are the blue lines. If the Germans decide to trigger their plan into effect, which was called the Schlieffen Plan, then the French would start their plan, Plan 13, and they would attack through the Alps here. So the armies kind of get flip-flopped, and eventually they work their way back to where they're supposed to be. This is what happens. Russia mobilizes, the Germans attack France, France attacks Germany. The battle line is set right along the German border up into Belgium, and then everything stops. Once the people get on the right side, they start to dig in and they start what's referred to as trench warfare. It's called trench warfare because this is the war of the shovel and the machine gun, and it's an industrialized war. They are mass producing weapons. And the biggest, most important, powerful weapon they had was the machine gun. The generals of World War I were still using old, outdated battle tactics from the Civil War, where they would line up against each other and shoot. And what they quickly realized was that was a terrible method. So they dug trenches so the machine gun fire would go over top. And eventually the Germans figured out gas, which would go in and settle in the trenches. And then the people would jump out and they could shoot them with the machine gun. And this is going to turn into a long, painful slog for about 3 years. And neither side, the British, French, or the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, see any hope of victory. And at some point, the war got so fierce and it had lasted so long that they really kind of forgot what they were fighting for. And the only reason they were fighting was so that they could make sure they'd win. One of the reasons for that is that the debt had gotten so big that either side felt that if they lost the war, then their country would be economically ruined for a generation. But this is an American history class. So what's the American reaction? Well, initially, the Americans feigned neutrality, and they used the Monroe Doctrine, going all the way back to what we talked about at the end of Standard I, beginning of Standard II, to justify staying out of the war. It's a European problem. The Monroe Doctrine said that the Europeans should stay in the Eastern Hemisphere, the United States will stay in the Western Hemisphere, and they won't interact with each other. That is the theoretical position of the Americans, right? They're going to stay neutral, but they don't stay neutral long because Woodrow Wilson supported the Allies, the British and the French. Mostly, there's a few reasons for that. One is the British blockade. Now, the Americans are going to say that they're upset that the German submarines are preventing a freedom of the seas, that Americans are worried that they're going to be attacked by the naval warfare. And that's true. That is a fear that they had. But the British blockade was also preventing American trade. The British were not allowing the Americans to sell weapons to Germany, only allow weapons to be sold to Britain. One of the reasons that the Germans were attacking American ships was because they didn't want the British to get those goods. It's kind of like an underwater blockade. The British were also controlling all the news cables from Europe, which means the United States was getting a lot of propaganda from the British. So the Americans were technically neutral, but they're kind of leaning towards supporting the British. It doesn't help that the Germans were using a tactic known as unrestricted submarine warfare, trying to break that English blockade. One of the ships that the Germans sank was referred to as the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was technically a passenger ship. And when the Germans sunk the Lusitania, a lot of Americans were mad because there's 128 Americans on board. And it wasn't soldiers. These were men, women, and children. And the United States immediately started calling for attacking Germany. The United States was outraged. The Germans threw up their hands and said, wait, they said it was a passenger ship, but it was lying. It's not a passenger ship. It was carrying weapons to get to England. Turns out the Germans were right. The ship was smuggling in weapons to England. But that doesn't matter to the Americans because you start seeing propaganda like what you get over here on the left-hand side of the screen. This is a woman and her baby, and it simply says enlist, right? Do you want to make up for the attack that the Germans had on Americans? Enlist in the Navy and help to attack those Germans. The United States begins preparing for war. Now, the Germans agreed to stop submarine warfare. They did for a time, but the United States starts preparing because they know that war is kind of right around the corner. They raised the military from 90,000 to 223,000. They start updating the ship, the fleet and all that. So they're preparing, and the Germans see that. Still, in the election of 1916, remember Wilson was elected in 1912 with that split vote. Roosevelt and Taft split the 1912 election and allowed the Democrat Woodrow Wilson to get elected. Wilson gets reelected in 1916, partially for his progressivism, But you can see in the list right up here above me, who keeps us out of war was the second thing that he had talked about. And above the cabin of this truck, peace with honor. Wilson is reelected with the promise that he kept us out of war. But within months after his reelection, the Germans started unrestricted submarine warfare again. And the United States says that the Germans not only have lied, they are also taking away our freedom of the seas. They're messing with their economy. They're going to start attacking Americans now. So the United States begins ramping up its propaganda campaign to help support the attacks against the Germans that are going to come. The thing that really got the Americans on the side of supporting war against the Germans was the Zimmermann telegram. Now, the Zimmermann telegram is going to be combined with that unrestricted submarine warfare to get the United States on the side of the Allies. And you can see in this cartoon here, again, cartoonists love using stereotypes. You have a Mexican person wearing a sombrero, and then you have the German person with the little pointy hat offering Mexico money and land in America. And if you look, that's Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. That's the land that the United States took from Mexico as part of the Mexican-American War. So the Germans are saying, in the Zimmermann telegram, which was intercepted by the British, given to the Americans, Germany is asking Mexico to attack the United States as a way to keep the United States from participating in the war in Europe. Mexico never really responds. Mexico doesn't have anything to do with it. But the United States now, the American population felt that they have been threatened, that they have essentially had an attack on American soil. And this outraged the United States. Combine that with the unrestricted submarine warfare, and the United States declares war in April of 1917. It has a positive impact on the American economy. The war in general did. You can see this chart here if you're looking at this one. The war starts in 1914. The dark line is imports, the dotted line is exports. Even in 1914, the United States is exporting more goods than imports. 1915, exporting more than imports. The United States gets involved right here in 1916, 1917, doesn't really get involved until mid-1917. But the balance of trade heavily favors America. The United States manufacturers are sending lots of stuff over to Europe. American farmers are sending lots of stuff over to Europe. So they're making a lot of money off of this war. Sometimes we learn the wrong lesson from that. But World War I did help the American economy. In the United States, 4 million men are going to go join the war. So somebody has to step up in order to make up for that difference. African Americans are going to move north. We're going to call that the Great Migration. Women join the workforce at this point, even in World War I. It's not just a World War II thing. After the war, all of those mostly white men are going to want their jobs back. So that's going to cause a lot of tensions. We're going to see that with the Red Summer of 1919. We're going to see women sent back into the homes. One of the most famous units of World War I was actually a segregated unit called the Harlem Hellfighters. You can see here, this is an all-black unit. They are highly decorated. That says dedicated. It should say decorated, which means they won a lot of medals. They were there for 191 days in France fighting. And again, segregation and racism, it's mostly white officers, but the Harlem Hellfighters fought bravely. They won a lot of medals. And then they're going to come home and face racism and segregation from their countrymen. This is going to become a problem we're going to see in that Red Summer of 1919 again. African Americans that did not join the military, and because not all of them joined the military, are going to move from the rural South, and they're going to move to American cities, mostly in the North and even in the out West. You can see that in this map here, right? The southern states in the red are going to see a population loss, and the things that's pushing those African Americans out of the South are the things you can see in this political cartoon, right? You can see this person being lynched right here, right? You can see him being lynched. And then there's poverty and all that segregation in the South. You can see he's not dressed very well. So de jure segregation, Jim Crow laws, the segregation by law, the poverty of the sharecroppers, and lynchings in the South are going to push African Americans out of the South. And the thing that's pulling them up to those northern and western cities are jobs, mostly in the defense industry, and ethnic neighborhoods like Harlem that are going to be a place where African Americans can live and work and have a culture together. We're going to see that in the 1920s with the Harlem Renaissance. So the United States needs to maintain support for the war as well. Wars are easy to start. It's harder to keep the public behind them when they start seeing their husbands and sons return in caskets. So there's a lot of propaganda. In the United States, German words were changed. You couldn't go to the store and buy sauerkraut. You could buy Victory cabbage. You couldn't buy bratwurst, but you could have Liberty sausage, right? So German words are changed. German books are banned or even burned. There's even some German folks that are lynched. That's a big deal because there's 8 million German people of German descent in the United States, and they were attacked, and their civil liberties were going to be taken away as a result of this war. The United States also needs to pay for the war somehow. Income taxes were available, but still not heavily used. Remember, we said Wilson had a 1% income tax on incomes over $3,000 a year. It's not a huge income tax. So they got to pay for it somehow. And the way they pay for it is through Liberty bonds or war bonds. So the American population is going to loan money to the government. The government is going to spend money it doesn't have, which is called deficit spending. And then they're going to pay that back later when those bonds become mature. So this is going to help finance the war. So remember the idea of a Liberty bond or a war bond. And if you look behind me over here on the wall is a Dr. Seuss poster from World War II asking for people to buy war bonds. Civil liberties are going to be taken away, right? Civil liberties are things like free speech and freedom of religion and, freedom of the press. The United States passes the Espionage and Sedition Act, which forbid people from speaking against the government's war efforts. It sounds a lot like the Alien and Sedition Act from Unit 1. This cartoonist here, I forget who the cartoonist is, but if you notice here, this guy here, bearded, long hair, wearing a crown of thorns, halo, says this man subjected himself to imprisonment and probably being shot or hanged. The prisoner used language tending to discourage men from enlisting in the U.S. Army. It's proven and indeed admitted that among his incendiary statements were "thou shalt not kill" and "blessed are the peacemakers." Socialists, especially people that supported the working class, argued that World War I was simply the exploitation of the working class by the ruling elites, that wealthy, powerful people were sending poor working class people to go fight a war simply so that they could sell more guns and bombs and gas and tanks and all that stuff. What the Espionage Act and the Supreme Court case like Schenck versus the United States, which said that the government has the ability to stop free speech if it's going to hurt the war effort. What those things suggest is that sometimes the government has a national interest in protecting the country over individual rights. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. There's a lot of fear and racism, especially when World War I really takes off here. A lot of new immigrants are seen as the enemy, Southern and Eastern Europeans. And the government is going to use, and the people like those progressives are going to use, frankly, Jim Crow tactics to keep immigration down or to keep immigrants from being able to vote. The literacy test here, which was used to keep African Americans from voting as part of the Jim Crow laws, are going to be used against immigrants, not just African Americans. And that's how they're going to keep this the land of the free, right? There's a war on unions because workers many times were poor, unskilled workers. A lot of them were from other countries, were immigrants. And it was seen that somebody that went on strike or somebody that didn't try to give their 100% all at the factory was disloyal because they were working against the military. That the military was used to push people into a position to work hard and to keep their mouths shut. In 1917, Russia dropped out of the war. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in Russia and communists took over. Russia surrendered. They had a czar, which was an emperor, which was not democratic. Once the communist revolution takes place, which is also not democratic, but they dropped out of the war. And that means that only Britain and France were left as the major allies, which means only constitutional democracies were left. So now, Woodrow Wilson, who has the Zimmerman telegram, who can argue about freedom of the seas and unrestricted submarine warfare, who has already been supporting the Allies by buying and trading and getting our news from Britain. He says to Congress, the United States needs to make the world safe for democracy. And he asks Congress to declare war on Germany. And this is a propaganda poster. He's keeping the world safe for democracy. And the United States quickly declared war on Germany. Some people have argued that Wilson was really just trying to make sure that he could have an opportunity help set the peace. And you can see in this cartoon, the guy at the bottom is Kaiser Wilhelm, the leader of Germany. And the way for him to get to a peace plan is to follow the 14 steps. There's 14 steps. These are the points that Wilson tried to make to prevent a future war. And he said the biggest thing is to have national self-determination. The Serbians wanted their own country. They should have been allowed to have that. Freedom of the seas. The United States said that all countries should be able to have freedom of the seas. They should be able to trade if they want. But most importantly for Wilson was his League of Nations. So the big problem was everybody just jumped right to fighting, and the war could have been prevented if there was some place for diplomacy and negotiations. He's going to want to get those 14 points into the peace treaty. The United States sends troops in 1918. The United States is only over there for about a year and a half. But those doughboys, those big, rough, burly Americans, went over to the Western Front and helped quickly turn the tide in favor of the British and the French. The Germans' forces quickly, who are already tired and strapped, quickly surrendered. After 19 months, Germany collapsed. There's an armistice that's called on November 11th at 11 o'clock in 1918, which essentially ends World War I. And then they got to go and set the peace treaty, which is going to be even more difficult. It's referred to as the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles is just outside of Paris. It's a palace, and it's where they decided to write that peace treaty. So Wilson, for the first time in American history, a sitting president, Woodrow Wilson, leaves the United States to attend this peace conference. Now, the problem is Wilson wanted to get those 14 points put into the peace treaty to prevent a future big war. But Britain and France were not interested in that at all. They had suffered 4 years. They had lost almost an entire generation of young men. Their economy was in ruins. They had no interest in settling a peace that would prevent future wars. What they wanted was to punish Germany. So they included a bunch of really important things in this peace treaty. They established a war guilt clause where they said that the Germans were responsible for starting World War I. But if you go all the way back to the beginning of your notes, the Germans did not start World War I. It was the Serbians who killed an Austro-Hungarian. The Austro-Hungarians wanted to punish Serbia, which brought Russia into the war, which finally brought Germany in. So why do they want to make Germany take responsibility for starting the war? Is because the real reason is they wanted to, one, embarrass them, but two, force them to pay reparations. They wanted the Germans to be forced to pay money to pay the debts of the British and the French. They also reduced the German military. They scuttled the German Navy. So basically, they took away all of their ability to make war, to protect themselves. This makes the Germans feel vulnerable and weak, which is going to come back later to haunt the British and the French. They do get the League of Nations put in place. That was the one thing Wilson was able to get in there. But the League of Nations is going to be very controversial in the United States because of this idea. The League of Nations, right? The League of Nations would have required the United States to be part of this organization that would have helped keep other countries in check. Now, Wilson negotiated the treaty, but the Senate had to verify that treaty, right? They have to ratify it. They have to sign off on it. Wilson was a Democrat, and the Senate was controlled by Republicans. The Republicans opposed the League of Nations, partially because they opposed Wilson, but mostly they were worried about the United States sovereignty. If a country were to go to war, the United States might be dragged along with it. If the League of Nations decided that that a country needed to be put back in place, the American military might be used by the League of Nations, or the United States might be forced to pass a law that it didn't like because of the League of Nations. So you can see here in this cartoon, Uncle Sam literally feels like his hands are tied by other countries. And the Senate didn't like that idea. Now, Wilson thought that would be the best, that for the country, that it would allow world peace and the economy would flourish. He decided that he wasn't going to try to figure this out with the Senate. He was going to go directly to the people. And if his candidate, if in 1920, if the Democrats won the Senate, then the Treaty of Versailles would be ratified through those Democratic senators. The problem is that Wilson, when he was out campaigning for the treaty, had a stroke, and he was largely incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. That means that there was nobody really out there championing the treaty. And you can see here the United States Senate is jumping through the window to break up the marriage between Uncle Sam and foreign entanglements, right? Essentially keeping the United States out of the League of Nations, which is the book that the priest there is holding. Americans are ready to move on. They don't want any more of this involvement in the world. They want to return to isolationism. They do not want to be part of this anymore. They want to remain neutral. They call that normalcy, going back to staying out of the war, staying out of European affairs, going back to the Monroe Doctrine. This is going to be the basis of the return to normalcy of the 1920s we're going to talk about in the next unit. The treaty is rejected by the people. It's rejected by the Senate. And the United States has to figure out what to do in the post-war period. There's a lot of problems transitioning from war to peace. All of that production that had been going into fighting the war all of a sudden is going to drop or have to transition back to peacetime products. All of those soldiers coming back from war are going to want their jobs back. That's going to lead to an unemployment problem. All of the workers who had been kind of bludgeoned into going along with production to not striking because it was seen as unpatriotic, all of a sudden they're seeing their wages drop and they're seeing unemployment rise, and they're going to go on strike. And then there's even some riots, and this led to a fear among Americans that immigrants and radicals were taking over the United States. So there's this difficult transition out of World War I. It does lead to the Red Summer of 1919. All of those returning soldiers, right? Many of them are returning white soldiers. They're moving into back into areas that have just gone through the Great Migration. So they're moving into areas with a much higher Black population now. They're seeing their jobs have been taken by Black men. And there's a lot of tension between those soldiers that are returning and the workers there. There's a high population of Black soldiers that are coming back from the war, like those Harlem Hellfighters. And they're demanding to be treated as equal men. And a lot of the white supremacists didn't like that idea. So there's a lot of tension there. This is going to lead into the 1920s Red Scare, and it's one of the big impacts of the Great War, World War I.